In 1862, deep in the misty marshes of Georgia's fading old money elite, a twisted family secret unfolded that would shock the world if uncovered. Picture this: an enslaved woman, forced to impersonate her mistress on the most intimate night of her life, in a desperate gamble that turned a wedding into a nightmare of fire, deception, and survival. What started as a cruel scheme to preserve a crumbling dynasty became a tale of brutal revenge and impossible identity theft. Buried for decades, this story challenges everything we know about power, race, and resilience in America's dark past. Stick around as we unearth the truth, piece by shocking piece. The mystery of Willowbrook Plantation begins not in the mud and oaks of 1862, but in the sterile climate-controlled archives of Vanderbilt University in 1965. It begins with a single artifact, a daguerreotype discovered during a routine archaeological survey of the plantation's ruins. The image is pristine, capturing a woman of extraordinary composure in the late 1890s. Her gown is of dark, expensive silk, her hair impeccably styled, her gaze direct and unyielding. The inscription on the silver frame, polished to a high sheen, reads, "Emily Harrington Beaumont," a name synonymous with old Georgia power and the sole tragic survivor of a devastating family massacre. This photograph, however, presents an immediate and profound contradiction to the historical record. The woman, while possessing a complexion that would have allowed her to navigate the highest echelons of Southern society, has features, the broadness of her nose, the full curve of her lips, the unmistakable texture of her hairline that point to a clear African ancestry. Yet census documents, property deeds, and the meticulously kept Beaumont family genealogies list Emily Harrington as unequivocally white, born to one of the most powerful cotton patriarchs in the Oakwood parish. This single object, therefore, becomes the first crack in a carefully constructed historical facade, posing a question that history had never thought to ask. To understand the portrait's anomaly, one must return to the world that produced it. The Willowbrook Plantation in the years leading up to 1862. Willowbrook was an entity of suffocating isolation, an island of cotton surrounded by a miasma of bayou swamp, its grandeur slowly decaying under the oppressive Georgia humidity. It was ruled by Colonel Henry Whitaker, a man whose pride was as vast as his debts, and his wife, Madame Elizabeth, a woman of severe, almost feverish piety. Their world was built on a brutal and precarious order, where the lines between white and black, master and slave, were meant to be absolute and eternal. The center of this decaying world was their only daughter, Emily Harrington. From a young age, Emily was a creature of fragile temperament, prone to fits of melancholic hysteria and disconnected states that the era's medicine had no name for. She was a liability, a flaw in the family's pedigree that threatened its future. The colonel, a pragmatist above all else, saw her not as a daughter to be nurtured, but as an asset to be managed. Her impending arranged marriage to Charles Beaumont, the heir to a Savannah shipping fortune, was not a celebration of love, but a desperate financial transaction designed to save the Whitaker name from ruin. In this oppressive atmosphere lived another young woman, Sophia. She was an enslaved house servant purchased at the age of 6 for a singular disturbing purpose. She was chosen for her striking physical resemblance to the young Emily. The same height, the same delicate build, the same shade of hazel eyes. Sophia was not trained in the fields or the kitchens. She was raised in the main house, a constant shadow to her mistress. She was dressed in Emily's cast-off clothes, taught to mimic her posture, her gait, even the cadence of her speech. She was a living mirror, an instrument of social and psychological control. The relationship between the two young women was a complex tapestry of shared trauma and enforced identity. For Emily, Sophia was both a confidant and a haunting reflection of a self she could not control, a silent, obedient version of what she was supposed to be. For Sophia, Emily was the source of her strange, privileged position and the constant reminder of her absolute powerlessness. They were two halves of a single broken identity, trapped together in the gilded cage of Willowbrook, moving inexorably toward a wedding that would force their constructed reality to its breaking point. The colonel's ambition and Madame Whitaker's fanaticism created a pressure cooker of secrets and unspoken cruelties. The house itself, with its peeling paint and ever-present scent of decay and magnolia, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Every servant knew the fragility of the young mistress, and every servant knew of her uncanny shadow. The air was thick with a tension that went beyond the typical brutality of the slave system. It was a deeper, more personal kind of madness brewing in the heart of the Whittaker family. The impending marriage to Charles Beaumont was the catalyst. It represented the final commodification of Emily, the moment her purpose as a transactional object would be fulfilled. Her resistance to this fate grew more violent, her episodes more frequent. She was a ghost haunting her own life, while Sophia, her perfect double, moved through the house with a silence that could be mistaken for submission, but which concealed an intelligence and observational acuity that the Whittakers in their arrogance failed to recognize. The stage was set for a tragedy. The characters were locked into their roles. The desperate patriarch, the cruel matriarch, the unstable heiress, the powerful suitor, and the invisible slave who was trained to be a perfect copy. The narrative that would be passed down through generations, a story of madness and accidental fire, was about to be written in flames. But beneath that official account, another story, one of savage survival and impossible revenge, was waiting to be exhumed. The first documented evidence of the perverse experiment at the heart of the Whittaker family's darkness is found not in a letter or a diary, but in the cold transactional pages of Colonel Whittaker's personal ledger. The entry dated October 14, 1850, is logged between records of cotton yields and the purchase of livestock. Written in a sharp, impatient hand, it records the acquisition of a Negro girl, aged 6, named Sophia, for the exorbitant price of $800. The anomaly lies in the justification appended to the entry, a note of chilling psychological calculation that reveals the true nature of her purpose. The Colonel writes, "A remedy for Emily's melancholic hysteria." He does not describe Sophia as a playmate or a servant for his daughter, but as a therapeutic instrument. She will serve as her living shadow, a constant reflection of composure. The girl will be dressed, combed, and trained to move as Emily does. In seeing perfect obedience in a form so like her own, my daughter may yet learn it. In observing a placid spirit, she may in time find her own. This entry transforms Sophia from a mere slave into a psychological effigy, a human tool designed to correct the perceived flaws in the Whittaker bloodline. This document, buried among financial records, is the foundational text of the macabre family mystery. It codifies the Colonel's cruel pragmatism and establishes the unsettling mirroring that would define the two young women's lives. It is the first proof that Sophia's resemblance to Emily was not a coincidence to be exploited later, but the very reason for her presence at Willowbrook. She was curated, molded, and refined over years to be an identical yet subordinate version of the White Heiress, a dark secret hidden in plain sight within the household. The ledger entry reveals a level of premeditation that is absent from the official narrative of spontaneous tragedy. The Colonel was not merely a callous slave owner. He was the architect of a deeply disturbing social and psychological experiment. He was attempting to cure his daughter's mental illness, not with care, but by creating a controllable replica of her. This act demonstrates a profound detachment from the humanity of both his daughter and the enslaved child he purchased, viewing them as components in a system to be managed for the preservation of his legacy. The language used is clinical, devoid of any emotional consideration. He refers to Sophia as the girl and a form reducing her to an object. Emily, in turn, is a problem to be solved, her hysteria, an inconvenience to the family's strategic ambitions. The coldness of the entry stands in stark contrast to the passionate, chaotic events that would later consume the family. It is the rational blueprint for an irrational horror, the first quiet note in a symphony of madness and destruction. This ledger entry also provides the first hint of the visual confusion that would become central to the climax of the story. For 12 years from 1850 to 1862, the household staff, the family, and any rare visitors would have witnessed the strange spectacle of two Emilys, one white and volatile, the other enslaved and composed. This long-term conditioning, this blurring of identity, was not an accident, but a deliberate strategy. The Colonel was in essence creating a fail-safe, a spare part, though he could not have imagined the way in which it would ultimately be used. The existence of this document fundamentally alters our understanding of the power dynamics at Willowbrook. It was not just a house of masters and slaves, but a laboratory of identity. Sophia's role was unique. She was simultaneously invisible as a slave and hyper-visible as Emily's double. She was conditioned to know every nuance of her mistress's being, making her uniquely capable of either perfect service or perfect subversion. The colonel, in trying to control his daughter's mind, had inadvertently created the one person who could dismantle his entire world. Furthermore, the price paid for Sophia, $800, a sum usually reserved for skilled male artisans or prime field hands, underscores her importance to the colonel's plan. This was not a casual purchase. This was a significant investment in a long-term high-stakes psychological gambit. He was betting a small fortune that he could mold one human being to fix another. A hubristic assumption that would have catastrophic consequences. The ledger, when viewed with the hindsight provided by the 1965 discoveries, is no longer just a financial record. It is a confession. It is the quiet, methodical beginning of a dark story that would end in fire and blood. It documents the creation of a ghost, a shadow, who would one day step out of the darkness and claim the substance, leaving the official history as nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. The years leading up to the fateful wedding are documented through a collection of letters from Madame Elizabeth Whittaker to her sister Genevieve in Savannah. These letters, preserved by the recipient's family, form a harrowing chronicle of Emily's escalating mental decline and Elizabeth's increasingly desperate and fanatical response. They are filled with a suffocating blend of Southern gentility and private horror, painting a portrait of a family imploding under the weight of its own secrets. The accumulation of these written records reveals a pattern of escalating crisis that makes the eventual tragedy feel not just possible but inevitable. In a letter from 1858, Elizabeth describes Emily's refusal to entertain suitors, writing of her episodes of unholy shrieking and her sudden violent outbursts. She mentions Sophia only in passing as a calming presence. Only the girl Sophia can soothe her. It is a strange and unsettling bond. At times I feel as if the shadow has more substance than the girl herself. This casual observation reveals both the success of the colonel's experiment and Elizabeth's growing unease with the identity confusion it has created within her own home. By 1861, with the marriage to Charles Beaumont arranged and fast approaching, Elizabeth's letters take on a darker, more desperate tone. She details Emily's new, more specific delusion, a belief that Sophia is actively stealing her face in the mirror. Elizabeth writes she shatters looking glasses and weeps that her reflection is not her own. She claims the slave girl stands behind her wearing her soul. It is the devil's work, a test of my faith. Elizabeth's piety becomes a lens through which she interprets her daughter's illness as a spiritual battle, justifying ever more extreme measures of control. The correspondence reveals that the plan to use Sophia as a replacement was not a last-minute decision born of panic, but a possibility that Elizabeth had been contemplating for some time. In a letter from January 1862, 2 months before the wedding, she writes cryptically to her sister, "The union with the Beaumonts must proceed for the salvation of this family. If the vessel is unwilling, then the spirit of the agreement must be honored by other means. Providence will provide a solution for the devout, no matter the cost." This passage is a thinly veiled articulation of her willingness to subvert the truth for the sake of appearances and financial security. The letters also document the increasing physical and emotional abuse inflicted upon Emily. Elizabeth describes locking her daughter in her room for days at a time, forcing her to fast and pray for deliverance from her demons. These accounts of imprisonment foreshadow the ultimate act of cruelty that would take place in the plantation's basement. The home ceases to be a sanctuary and becomes a prison with Madame Whittaker as its pious and unyielding warden, convinced she is acting in accordance with God's will. Crucially, Sophia remains largely invisible in these letters, mentioned only as a functionary or a feature of Emily's delusions. This erasure from the written record is typical of the slave experience, but in this context, it is also a strategic oversight on Elizabeth's part. She sees Sophia not as a person with thoughts, feelings, or the capacity for agency, but as an object, a tool. This fundamental miscalculation, this failure to see the humanity in the shadow, would be her ultimate undoing. The final letter in the collection is dated March 8, 1862, just 4 days before the wedding ceremony. It is short, and its tone is one of grim finality. Genevieve, do not be alarmed by what you may hear. The wedding will take place as planned. I have found a way to ensure Emily's compliance. She will be present in spirit, if not in will. Pray for the souls of this house. This letter is in essence a pre-confession, an admission that a terrible act is about to be committed in the name of preserving family honor and divine order. The accumulation of these letters creates an unbearable sense of dramatic irony. We see the disaster approaching documented in Elizabeth's own hand. While she remains blind to the true nature of the threat, she fears her daughter's madness and the social ruin it represents. But she is completely oblivious to the quiet, observant intelligence of the enslaved woman she plans to use and discard. She is meticulously documenting her own downfall. Together, these letters form a powerful body of anomalous evidence. They expose the private madness festering behind the public facade of the Whittaker family. They chart the path from a cruel psychological experiment to a criminal conspiracy. They reveal a mother willing to sacrifice both her daughter and an innocent slave to uphold a lie. And they set the stage for a night of fire and retribution, making it clear that the tragedy of Willowbrook was not an accident but an execution. The official version of events, the narrative that would stand unchallenged for over a century, is preserved in the sparse matter-of-fact report of the Oakwood Parish Sheriff, Elias Thorne. The document filed on March 19, 1862, a week after the fire, represents the first formal attempt to make sense of the carnage at Willowbrook Plantation. It is a text born of chaos pieced together from the traumatized testimony of the groom Charles Beaumont and the terrified, disjointed accounts of a few surviving field hands who witnessed the inferno from a distance. The hypothesis it presents is simple, tragic, and entirely wrong. Sheriff Thorne's report concludes that the fire was the direct result of Emily Harrington's long-documented mental instability. He writes based on the testimony of Mr. Beaumont and the known history of the deceased's fragile disposition. This office concludes that Miss Emily Harrington, in a fit of violent madness upon her wedding night, set fire to the nuptial bed linens. The report paints a picture of a tragic bride consumed by her own demons who chose self-destruction over a marriage she violently opposed, inadvertently taking her family with her. The report details the death of Colonel Henry and Madame Elizabeth Whittaker, whose bodies were found in the main hall, presumably overcome by smoke while trying to escape. It also lists several unidentified Negro servants as casualties, their bodies too badly burned to be recognized, their individual identities erased even in death. This detail is crucial, as it provides the official cover for Sophia's disappearance from the historical record. She's assumed to be among the anonymous charred remains found in the wreckage of the main house. The hero of the official story is Charles Beaumont. The sheriff's report praises his extraordinary bravery, recounting his testimony of waking to the flames and pulling his new bride from the burning bedroom. The bride he saved, of course, was Sophia, but in the smoke, panic, and darkness, her identity was never questioned. Her survival in the official account is framed as a tragic miracle, the sole light in a night of utter darkness. The report notes her subsequent state of shock and muteness as a natural consequence of the trauma she endured. This first hypothesis is a masterpiece of convenient explanation. It neatly aligns with the community's pre-existing knowledge of Emily's strangeness. It provides a clear, understandable motive, a madwoman's act, and avoids any uncomfortable questions about the deeper sickness within the Whittaker family or the brutal system they oversaw. It is a story that allows the social order to remain undisturbed. The powerful Beaumont family has its tragic but blameless bride, and the dark secrets of Willowbrook are buried with the bodies in its ashes. The power of this document lies in its authority. As the official legal conclusion, it effectively closed the case. It became the definitive history repeated in newspapers, family letters, and local lore. Any lingering doubts or whispers among the enslaved community were just that. Whispers with no power to challenge the written word of a white sheriff. The document institutionalized the lie, giving it the weight of law and the veneer of objective investigation. However, even within this official report, read with the benefit of a century of hindsight, there are subtle inconsistencies. The sheriff notes the unusual speed and intensity of the fire, as described by witnesses, something he attributes to the dry timber of the old house, but which hints at the use of an accelerant. He also records Charles Beaumont's initial confusion, His claim that the woman he rescued was calmer than a bride ought to be amid such hellfire, a detail that is quickly dismissed as a product of his own shock. The report's conclusion is also notable for what it omits. There is no mention of an investigation into the state of the bodies, no autopsy records, no serious attempt to identify the enslaved victims. The entire process is cursory, designed to close a chapter rather than uncover a truth. The authorities are not looking for a crime. They are documenting a tragedy, and their investigation is shaped entirely by that preconceived notion. Ultimately, Sheriff Thorne's report is the foundational lie upon which Sophia's new life was built. It provided her with a name, a history, and a public narrative that protected her from scrutiny. It transformed a complex crime of conspiracy, murder, and identity theft into a simple, sad story of a mentally ill girl. It was the first and most important layer of earth shoveled onto a mass grave of secrets, ensuring they would remain buried for a very long time. Once the official narrative of the Willowbrook fire was established, the social and legal mechanisms of 1860s Georgia society moved quickly to solidify it. The public record, as seen in newspapers and court documents, demonstrates a collective effort to smooth over the rough edges of the tragedy and absorb it into the accepted history of the region's great families. This process, however, was not seamless. Traces of a social fracture, whispers of doubt and contention can be found in the margins of these official texts, revealing that the lie, while publicly accepted, was not universally believed. An article published in the Savannah Herald on April 15, 1862, exemplifies the public-facing version of events. The piece is a flowery eulogy for the Whittaker family and a celebration of the resilience of the young Madame Beaumont. It describes Emily, Sophia, as a figure of tragic grace, noting her reclusive nature in the weeks following the fire as a sign of profound mourning. The article commends her for her quiet dignity and her strength in the face of unspeakable loss, effectively cementing her new identity in the public consciousness and framing her as a sympathetic victim rather than a subject of suspicion. This newspaper account served a crucial social function. It reassured the local elite that the social order remained intact. The powerful Beaumont family had not been sullied by their brief association with the mad Whittakers. Rather, their heir had proven his valor, and his bride, though traumatized, was a model of decorous suffering. The story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of bad blood and the importance of mental and emotional fortitude, a narrative that reinforced the values of the planter class. However, the first sign of a fracture appears in the legal challenges that followed. Court records from late 1862 show that the Whittakers' distant cousins in England, upon learning of the tragedy, filed a petition to contest the inheritance. The claim, though ultimately dismissed, is revealing. Their petition cites profound irregularities in the accounts of the fire and alludes to long-standing rumors regarding the true nature of the Whittaker household and the uncertain identity of the surviving bride. This legal challenge was a direct assault on the official story. The court's swift dismissal of the claim is as significant as the claim itself. The parish judge ruled that the petition was based on hearsay and malicious gossip, giving full credence to the sheriff's report and the testimony of Charles Beaumont. This decision illustrates the power of the local institutions to protect their own. The Beaumonts were a pillar of the community. Challenging their version of events was tantamount to challenging the stability of the entire social hierarchy. The English cousins as outsiders stood no chance. Yet the rumor of an uncertain identity did not completely disappear. It retreated from the official record and went underground, surviving in the oral traditions of the region's Black and Creole communities. These were the whispers that could not be recorded in a newspaper or a court document, but were passed down through generations. Stories of the strange Whittaker girl and her twin slave, of a fire that burned too hot and too fast, of a rescue that seemed too neat. This social fracture, the gap between the official written history and the suppressed oral history, is a key element of the mystery. The dominant society accepted the lie because it was convenient and reinforced their worldview. The marginalized communities harbored the truth because they were closer to it. They were the invisible witnesses whose testimony was never sought and would never have been believed. Furthermore, Charles Beaumont's own actions suggest a man haunted by doubt. After the fire, he and Emily moved to his family's mansion in Savannah, But he quickly fell into a pattern of heavy drinking and erratic behavior, according to the private letters of his family members. He died just 2 years later in 1864, officially of yellow fever. But family lore suggests a man who had been consumed by a deep and unspoken psychological torment, perhaps stemming from the lingering, unanswerable questions of his wedding night. The social record, therefore, shows a community actively engaged in a process of forgetting. The newspaper articles, the court rulings, and the public mourning were all rituals designed to bury an uncomfortable truth. The fire at Willowbrook was not just a physical event, it was a social one. It was an opportunity for the community to purge the memory of the Mad Whitakers and reaffirm its own values of order, honor, and patriarchal control. The dismissal of the cousins' claims and the suppression of local rumors were acts of collective denial. The fracture was real, but the society's immune system, its network of legal and social institutions, worked efficiently to seal it off. The truth was treated like a disease, quarantined and left to die in the memories of those who had no power to speak it aloud, ensuring that the dark secret of the slave who replaced her mistress would remain safe for another 100 years. For 103 years, the official history of the Willowbrook tragedy remained sealed, its inconsistencies dismissed, its secrets protected by the passage of time. The irrefutable evidence that would finally shatter the century-old lie came not from a historian's deliberate search, but from the accidental turn of a shovel. During the 1965 archaeological survey of the plantation ruins, authorized by Vanderbilt University to study antebellum architectural techniques, a worker's tool struck something hard beneath a rotten floorboard in the collapsed remains of the kitchen structure. It was not stone or brick, but a small oilskin-wrapped package preserved from the elements by its careful burial. Inside the package, nested in dry, decaying cotton, was a small leather-bound journal. Its pages were water-damaged and brittle. The iron gall ink faded to a ghostly brown, but the handwriting was for the most part legible. The script was elegant and practiced, the prose clear and intelligent. The contents of this journal constituted the single most important discovery in the history of the Whitaker case. It was the personal diary of Sophia, written in the weeks, days, and even hours leading up to the fire of 1862. This artifact was the voice of the ghost, a direct testimony from the heart of the crime. The documented impact of this discovery was immediate and profound. It provided for the first time an eyewitness account that directly contradicted every element of Sheriff Thorne's official report. The journal was not the fragmented, terrified rambling of a victim, but the cool, methodical record of a conspiracy, a plan for survival, and an act of calculated revenge. It transformed Sophia from a passive footnote in a tragic story into its central active protagonist. The irrefutable evidence of her literacy alone was a stunning revelation, a secret she must have guarded as carefully as her life. The journal's existence immediately recontextualized every other piece of evidence. The colonel's ledger entry about her training was no longer just a record of a cruel experiment. It was the explanation for her sophisticated prose. Madame Whitaker's letters about Emily's delusions took on a new, sinister meaning, confirming the identity confusion that Sophia would ultimately exploit. The sheriff's report was exposed not as a flawed investigation, but as a complete fabrication, a narrative constructed to hide a truth that no one in power wished to confront. The historians at Vanderbilt who first authenticated the journal were faced with a historical bombshell. The document proved that a crime of immense complexity had occurred. It was not a simple case of a mad woman and a fire. It was a story of false imprisonment, conspiracy to commit murder, and a stunning act of identity theft. The journal was the missing link, the Rosetta Stone that allowed every other piece of the puzzle to fall into place, revealing a picture far darker and more complex than anyone had imagined. The physical state of the journal itself told a story. The water damage suggested it had been exposed to the elements, perhaps carried by Sophia as she fled through the swamp. The final pages were smeared with soot, tangible proof that it had been present during the inferno. The fact that it was buried beneath the kitchen, a space traditionally part of the slave domain, indicated a deliberate act of preservation. Sophia had hidden her testimony, her truth, in a place only she would think to look, perhaps with the intention of one day returning for it, or perhaps simply as a final act of ensuring her story would not be completely erased. The impact of this irrefutable evidence was to force a complete re-evaluation of Emily Harrington Beaumont. She was no longer the tragic porcelain survivor of local lore. She was Sophia, a brilliant and ruthless strategist who had seized a moment of chaos to escape bondage and claim a life of freedom and privilege. The discovery of the journal retroactively charged her entire life with a new meaning. Her reclusiveness was not a sign of trauma, but a necessary precaution to protect her secret. Her quiet dignity was the mask of a woman who had committed an unforgivable, but perhaps justifiable act. The journal, therefore, did more than just solve a historical mystery. It challenged the very nature of the historical record itself. It demonstrated how easily the voices of the enslaved could be erased, and how a dominant narrative, once codified in official documents, could obscure the truth for generations. It was a testament to the power of the written word. Both the power of the sheriff's report to create a lie and the power of Sophia's hidden journal to eventually destroy it. The discovery was a resurrection. It brought Sophia back from the anonymous grave of the unidentified Negro servants and gave her back her name, her story, and her agency. The impact was absolute. The official history was dead, and a new, more terrible, and more triumphant story had risen from the ashes to take its place. Sophia's journal is not merely a record of her own experiences. It is a meticulous documentation of the complete moral and functional collapse of the authority figures who ruled Willowbrook. Through her observant eyes, we witness the unraveling of the Whitaker family's power, a process driven by their own cruelty, desperation, and fatal underestimation of the woman they sought to control. The journal entries from the final days before the wedding paint a chilling picture of a household where the lines between order and madness, justice and criminality have completely dissolved. In an entry dated March 10, 1862, 2 nights before the ceremony, Sophia records the event that triggers the final catastrophic phase of the conspiracy. She describes being awoken by a muffled struggle and peering from her small attic window to see Madame Whitaker and the plantation overseer, a man named Harlan, dragging a drugged and semi-conscious Emily from the main house. They take her not to a carriage, but toward the back of the property to the heavy wooden doors of the fruit cellar, a dark, damp space dug into the earth beneath the kitchen. This act marks the point of no return for Elizabeth, a complete abdication of her authority as a mother in favor of her role as a criminal conspirator. The following morning, as recorded in a subsequent entry, Madame Whitaker summons Sophia to her private study. Sophia's prose here is stark and clinical, a testament to her control in the face of mortal terror. She transcribes Elizabeth's instructions verbatim, providing a direct record of the plot and the collapse of any semblance of moral authority. You will wear the dress. You will take the vows. Mr. Beaumont is a man of appetites. In the dark, he will not know the difference. After the contract is sealed by consummation, all witnesses will be silenced. The girl in the cellar, the overseer, and you. God will forgive a necessary sin to preserve a righteous family. This recorded confession reveals the terrifying depth of Elizabeth's fanaticism. She is no longer just a cruel mistress. She has become the architect of a multi-stage crime involving kidnapping, false imprisonment, forced substitution, and a planned triple homicide. Her authority, which she believes is divinely sanctioned, has become a justification for monstrous acts. She has collapsed into a state of pure murderous pragmatism, where human lives are disposable pawns in her quest to save the family's name and fortune. The journal also documents the complicity and subsequent breakdown of the other figures of authority. The colonel, Sophia notes, has retreated into a state of alcoholic denial. He remains in his study drinking brandy, refusing to acknowledge the disappearance of his daughter or the palpable tension in the house. His authority has collapsed not through action, but through a cowardly and deliberate inaction. He has abdicated his role as patriarch, leaving his wife to execute the brutal details of their shared ambition. The overseer, Harlan, is depicted as a man caught between his orders and his fear. Sophia describes him as constantly watching her, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and dread. He is the muscle of the operation, the enforcer of Elizabeth's will, but his authority is brittle. He knows he is a loose end, a witness to be silenced. His power on the plantation, once absolute over the enslaved population, has been subverted by his role in a secret crime that makes him as vulnerable as the people he terrorizes. Sophia's documentation of these events is a powerful act of resistance. By writing down Elizabeth's words, by recording the details of the conspiracy, she is refusing to be an invisible victim. She is creating a record, a counter-narrative to the one being forced upon her. She is using the tool of literacy, a skill forbidden to her and likely learned in secret by observing Emily's lessons, to bear witness to the absolute corruption of the powerful. The household, as described in the journal, ceases to function as a home and becomes a crime scene in waiting. The other house slaves are described as moving with a silent, watchful fear, sensing the profound wrongness, but powerless to act. The authority of the masters, once maintained through a combination of tradition, law, and violence, has been hollowed out from the inside. It has become nothing more than a criminal enterprise held together by a shared, deadly secret. This section of the journal is crucial because it establishes the immediate stakes for Sophia. She is not just being forced to participate in a deception. She has been given a death sentence. Her decision to act to fight back is not born of a vague desire for freedom, but of the absolute certainty that she will be murdered as soon as her usefulness has expired. The authority of her masters has collapsed into a simple, brutal equation: her temporary utility versus her permanent silence. The journal thus serves as the ultimate record of this collapse. It captures the moment when a family's power becomes so detached from morality that it begins to consume itself. Madame Whittaker, in her quest to preserve the family's authority, has destroyed its very foundation, turning her home into a place of terror and her power into a tool of pure evil. The stage is set for a rebellion, not of the enslaved against the master, but of a single condemned woman against her would-be executioners. The fulcrum of the entire story, the detail that shifts Sophia's fate from certain death to a desperate chance at survival, is revealed in a section of her journal dedicated to her clandestine conversations with the imprisoned Emily. This part of the text functions as a hidden source within a hidden source, documenting a secret exchange that no one, least of all Madame Whittaker, could have ever anticipated. It reveals that Emily, in her moments of lucidity, was not just a passive victim, but a key, albeit unwitting, accomplice in Sophia's eventual escape and revenge. Sophia describes how in the dead of night, she would slip down to the kitchen and press her ear to the floorboards above the fruit cellar. Emily, trapped in the cold, damp darkness below, would sometimes be lucid, her voice a faint whisper rising through the cracks. In these stolen moments, the lines between mistress and slave, shadow and substance, dissolved completely. They were simply two young women trapped by the same monstrous ambition, sharing a desperate and intimate connection in their final hours. During one of these conversations, as recorded by Sophia, Emily reveals a secret of the house's construction, a piece of information passed down to her by her grandfather, who had built the original structure. She speaks of a hidden passage concealed behind a loose section of the stone wall at the back of the wine racks in the cellar. It was an old smuggler's tunnel long forgotten that led from the house under the gardens and emerged in a dense thicket of oak trees at the edge of the swamp. It was a secret escape route, a ghost passage known only to the Whittaker bloodline. This revelation, meticulously recorded in Sophia's journal, is the story's turning point. It provides Sophia with a piece of knowledge that transforms her situation. She is no longer merely a prisoner waiting for her execution. She has been given a map. The hidden source of this information, Emily herself, the person she is meant to replace, adds a layer of profound and tragic irony. The true Heiress, in a final act of connection with her shadow, provides the very key that will allow the shadow to usurp her life. The journal entry details the immense risk Sophia took in these conversations. The overseer Harlan patrolled the grounds, and a single misplaced sound could have exposed her. Yet she returned to the floorboards night after night, gathering information, piecing together a plan. This act demonstrates her extraordinary courage and her calculated assessment of risk. She understood that knowledge was her only weapon, her only shield against the fate that had been decreed for her. The discovery of the hidden passage does more than just provide a means of escape. It also deepens the psychological complexity of the story. It suggests a bond between Sophia and Emily that transcended their prescribed roles. Emily's decision to share this secret can be interpreted in several ways. As an act of rebellion against her parents, as a gesture of genuine affection for the only person who understood her suffering, or perhaps as a final desperate attempt to save a part of herself by saving her double. This hidden knowledge also reshaped Sophia's own plans. Her initial thoughts might have been limited to a simple, desperate act of defiance. But with the knowledge of the tunnel, a more complex and audacious plan becomes possible. She now has a way to control the chaos she is about to unleash. She can start the fire, free Emily, and use the ensuing panic to disappear, either with her mistress or alone. The discovery of this hidden source elevates her from a mere survivor to a master strategist. The journal's documentation of this secret is a testament to the unexpected ways that power can shift. The Whitakers believed they held all the cards. They had the wealth, the social standing, and the physical control. But Sophia, through her quiet observation and her forbidden literacy, and Emily, through her inherited forgotten knowledge, possessed a different kind of power, the power of secrets. It was this intangible currency that would ultimately prove more valuable than all the cotton in the fields of Willowbrook. This section of the narrative, therefore, is the discovery that unlocks the entire climax. It is the secret within the secret, the hope within the horror. It arms Sophia with the one thing her captives could not anticipate, a blueprint for the house's hidden frailties. The Whitaker mansion, like the family itself, had a secret passage leading to its own undoing. And now only Sophia knew where it was. The final entries of Sophia's journal, written by the flickering light of a stolen candle in the hours before the wedding ceremony, document the crystallization of her plan for decisive action. These pages are no longer just a record of events. They are a manifesto of intent, a cold and lucid justification for the fire and chaos she is about to unleash. The tone shifts from that of a fearful witness to that of a calculating executioner. She understands that she is trapped in a game where the only outcomes are her own death or a radical violent act of self-liberation. She chooses the latter. In an entry penned on the afternoon of March 12, 1862, Sophia justifies her impending actions with chilling clarity. They have given me her face, her walk, her name in the dark. They will have the bride they have spent 12 years creating, but they will not have my silence. This house built on the backs of my people and cemented with the madness of their own is a tomb. Tonight I will give it the fire it deserves. This passage frames her plan not as an act of desperate survival, but as an act of righteous cleansing justice. The fire is not just a tool for escape, it is a moral judgment. The journal details the meticulous preparations for her act of arson. She describes stealing a small flask of lantern oil from the supply shed, concealing it within the voluminous folds of the wedding dress she is being forced to wear. She maps out the timing in her mind, noting the way the dry Spanish moss hung from the rafters for the wedding decorations will act as a perfect conduit for the flames, ensuring the fire spreads with uncontrollable speed. Every detail is considered, every variable weighed. This is not the work of a panicked victim, but of a brilliant and determined strategist. Her justification is rooted in the fundamental inversion of her identity. For 12 years, I have been her shadow. They taught me to be invisible, to have no will of my own. But tonight, in her dress, with her name on my lips, I will be more real than she ever was. I will not die as Sophia, the slave. If I am to die tonight, I will die as Emily Harrington, the bride who chose to burn her world down rather than submit to it. In this, she articulates the core of her plan, to use the very identity forced upon her as a weapon against her creators. The journal also reveals her plan for Emily. She intends to use the fire as a diversion to free the true heiress from the cellar and guide her to the hidden passage. Her initial goal is not to replace Emily, but to save her, and in doing so, save herself. This detail adds a layer of moral complexity to her actions. She is not at this stage a cold-blooded usurper. She is an avenger and a liberator planning to rescue the one person in the house who has shown her a shred of humanity. The psychological state revealed in these entries is one of terrifying calm. The fear she must have felt is sublimated into a focused, almost transcendent resolve. She has been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, and in that space, she has found a strange and terrible freedom. She is no longer bound by the rules of the slave system or the fear of punishment. She is about to become an agent of chaos, a force of nature that will sweep through the corrupt house of Whitaker and cleanse it. The source provides a direct window into her motivation, preventing her actions from being interpreted as simple madness. She is not insane. She is terrifyingly sane. She has analyzed her situation, identified her enemies, and chosen her weapons. Her justification is a powerful indictment of the system that created her. She is not just fighting for her life. She is fighting against a world that has denied her very existence. And she is willing to burn that world to the ground to carve out a space for herself. This decision for decisive action, as justified in her own words, is the final step in her transformation. She sheds the identity of the submissive slave and dons the mantle of the avenger. The wedding dress is no longer a symbol of her violation, but her armor. The lantern oil is not just a fuel but the instrument of her judgment. The final lines of the entry before the ceremony are a quiet promise to herself. They call this place Willowbrook, the beautiful dream. Tonight, I will turn it into a beautiful nightmare. The words hang in the air. A declaration of war from a single invisible woman against an entire system of power. A promise that the coming night will bring not a union, but a reckoning. The last page of Sophia's journal is the most powerful and harrowing primary source in the entire historical record. It is a document written in the immediate aftermath of the fire, its paper smeared with soot and stained with what appears to be swamp water. The handwriting is frantic, a stark contrast to the measured prose of the earlier entries. It is a raw, breathless account of the climax, a final testimony from the heart of the inferno. This single page provides the definitive interpretation of the night's events, solving the mystery of Willowbrook once and for all. Sophia describes the moments in the nuptial chamber. She writes of Charles Beaumont's drunken tenderness, his whispered words meant for Emily. Then comes the moment of revelation. He lifted the veil. For a second there was only confusion in his eyes. Then the confusion turned to shock, and the shock to a dawning, horrified rage. She records his guttural cry not of passion, but of accusation, and the immediate appearance of the colonel and the overseer Harlan at the bedroom door. Their presence confirming the event was a prearranged test. The journal captures the colonel's hissed order to Harlan, a command of chilling finality. Finish it now. This is the moment her death sentence is to be carried out. But in that instant, Sophia acts. I kicked the lantern at the foot of the bed. The oil spilled across the lace and the dry wood. The flame did not crawl. It exploded. She describes the fire erupting with a supernatural speed, consuming the wedding decorations of Spanish moss and climbing the walls like a hungry beast. The next section of the entry details the chaos that followed. In the smoke and confusion, she slipped past the stunned men and ran not for the exit, but down the servants' stairs toward the kitchen. She recounts breaking the lock on the cellar door with a fireplace poker and pulling a terrified, disoriented Emily from the darkness. The two of them, the real bride and the false one, stood for a moment amidst the growing chaos. Two identical figures in the fiery light. The tragic turning point is described with heartbreaking clarity. As Sophia tried to pull her toward the secret passage, Emily, completely overwhelmed by the fire and her own fractured mental state, broke free. She did not understand. She saw the flames and screamed, "My name, not hers!" She ran back into the heart of the house toward her room as if seeking a familiar prison. Emily, in her final moments, ran not from her captives, but toward a memory of safety, a fatal miscalculation in a burning world. The final sentences of the journal are written with a sense of profound, exhausted finality. The swamp took Emily. She ran toward the fire and I toward the water. The fire took the house, the colonel, his wife, and their secrets. I walked out of the ashes with her name. It is the only thing I own now. It is my shield and my price. This statement is both a confession and a declaration of her new existence. She did not murder Emily. Fate, madness, and the fire did. She simply walked through the door that chaos had opened for her. The interpretation of this final source is unequivocal. The fire was an act of self-defense and righteous arson. Sophia's survival was not a miracle, but the result of her own courage, intelligence, and a tragic twist of fate. Emily's death was the final cruel consequence of her parents' abuse. Sophia did not steal a life. She picked one up from the ashes of a world that had tried to incinerate her. This last page transforms the narrative from a story of revenge into a complex meditation on identity, survival, and justice. Sophia's actions were violent and deceptive, but they were forged in the crucible of an even greater violence and deception. The journal proves that she was the architect of her own liberation, using the tools of her oppression, the identity forced upon her to craft a future. The soot-stained page is the definitive evidence. It is the voice from the flames, the testimony that corrects the historical record and gives Sophia the final word. It closes the case on what happened that night at Willowbrook, but it opens a much larger and more unsettling series of questions about the nature of identity and the price of freedom. The official paper trail that follows the fire of March 12, 1862, documents the seamless and successful integration of Sophia into her new identity as Emily Harrington Beaumont. The records show a woman who, after a period of intense trauma, navigated the legal and social structures of her time with remarkable skill, consolidating her power and erasing any trace of her former self. The documented consequences of that night reveal a life built on a foundation of audacious lies, a legacy preserved through the very instruments of a society that would have otherwise condemned her. The first document in this new life is a marriage certificate filed in the Oakwood Parish on March 13, 1862. It is signed by a shaken but compliant Charles Beaumont and a parish priest, and it bears the signature of Emily Harrington, written in a hand identical to the one in Sophia's journal. This piece of paper was her legal shield, the document that officially transformed her from property into a propertied wife. It was the cornerstone of her new identity, legally binding and publicly recognized. Following their move to Savannah, property deeds from 1864 show the transfer of the vast Beaumont shipping fortune and all associated holdings to Emily Beaumont upon the death of her husband Charles. His early demise from yellow fever just 2 years after their marriage made her a young and incredibly wealthy widow. The legal system, which recognized her as his legitimate wife, acted swiftly and efficiently to place the entirety of a powerful dynasty's assets under her control. The slave girl who was once worth $800 was now the sole mistress of a fortune worth tens of thousands. Census records from 1870, 1880, and 1890 track her life with cold statistical precision. They list Emily Beaumont, widow, as the head of a lavish household in Savannah's Garden District. The records note her race as white. She is listed as having been born in Georgia. There are no children. These documents are a testament to the success of her deception. She lived for decades under the watchful eye of the state, her assumed identity never once questioned by the official record keepers. In stark contrast, the historical record of Sophia simply ends. After the fire, her name vanishes from all plantation inventories, tax records, and slave registries. She is legally presumed to have died in the fire, one of the unidentified Negro servants mentioned in the sheriff's report. This documented erasure was as crucial to her survival as the acquisition of Emily's name. For her to live, Sophia had to die, and the bureaucratic indifference of the slave state provided the perfect cover for her disappearance. Her legacy as Emily Beaumont was one of quiet power and deep reclusiveness. She managed the Beaumont fortune astutely, growing the family's wealth through savvy investments, but she rarely appeared in society. This reclusiveness, publicly interpreted as the lifelong grief of a tragic widow, was in reality a brilliant strategy of self-preservation. By avoiding the scrutiny of Southern high society, she minimized the risk of her secret being exposed by someone who might have known the real Emily Harrington too well. The financial records show that she became a quiet philanthropist in her later years, donating significant, often anonymous sums to the city's first schools for freed black children and to orphanages that served the African American community. These acts, documented in the ledgers of charitable organizations, can be interpreted as a form of private atonement or a quiet acknowledgement of the world she came from. She used the wealth she had acquired through deception to support the very people the system she had escaped was designed to oppress. Upon her death in 1916, her will left the bulk of her fortune to these same charitable causes, a final act that baffled the distant Beaumont relatives who had hoped to inherit. Her legacy, therefore, is a strange and contradictory one. Publicly, she was Emily Beaumont, the last tragic scion of two powerful families. But her actions, her reclusiveness, and the final disposition of her wealth tell another story. They are the documented consequences of a hidden life, the faint echoes of the enslaved woman who refused to be erased. The complete absence of any document linking Emily to Sophia for over a century is perhaps the most powerful evidence of her intelligence. She did not just escape. She masterfully manipulated the very systems of documentation that defined and constrained people in her era. She used the power of paper, deeds, certificates, census forms to build a fortress around her lie. A fortress so strong that it would take 100 years and an accidental discovery to breach its walls. The discovery of Sophia's journal in 1965 did not rewrite history overnight. The Vanderbilt University historian who authenticated the document, a man named Dr. Alistair Finch, spent the last years of his life attempting to bring the story to light, but he was met with a wall of institutional resistance and quiet disbelief from the descendants of Georgia's elite families. He died in 1969, his comprehensive paper on the Willowbrook case unpublished, his findings relegated to a series of footnotes and archived notes. The journal and the paradoxical daguerreotype now sit together in the university's special collections, classified as historical anomalies of contested provenance. The story of Sophia, therefore, exists in a liminal space between documented fact and suppressed history. It is a truth that the official record still refuses to fully acknowledge. The public narrative remains largely that of the tragic Emily Harrington, a comforting story that does not force a confrontation with the brutal realities of the slave system or the profound agency of those it sought to crush. The case exposes the inertia of history, the tendency for accepted narratives, however false, to persist in the face of contradictory evidence. The analysis of the available sources leaves us with a portrait of a woman of extraordinary complexity. Was Sophia a heroic survivor, a righteous avenger who delivered a just, if brutal, punishment to her tormentors? Or was she a cold-blooded opportunist, a woman who seized a moment of tragedy to commit a successful and lifelong act of fraud? The documents support both interpretations. She was a victim who became a predator, a slave who became a master. She embodies the profound moral ambiguity that arises when the oppressed adopt the tools of the oppressor to survive. The final piece of the puzzle is not a document, but a piece of folklore. An oral history project conducted in the Oakwood area in the 1940s recorded the local legends of the descendants of enslaved families. One story, told by an elderly woman whose great-grandmother had been a field hand at Willowbrook, speaks of the Dame Cendre, the Ash Lady. She is described as a protective spirit who walks the swampy grounds where the old plantation once stood, a ghostly figure who is said to guard the land against the return of great evil. This legend suggests that Sophia's story in some form survived, transformed into a myth of a supernatural guardian. This epilogue leaves us with an open question. What is the true nature of justice? Sophia received no legal justice for the crimes committed against her, but she achieved a kind of poetic, almost biblical justice on her own terms. She took a name, a fortune, and a life, and in the end used her stolen power to aid the community from which she came. Her story is a testament to the idea that history is not a static set of facts, but a battlefield of competing narratives where the most powerful story, not necessarily the truest, often wins. And so the mystery ends where it began, with a portrait, the daguerreotype that Emily Beaumont kept hidden in the attic of her Savannah mansion until her death. The one discovered by Dr. Finch. It is the face of Sophia. She is no longer a young woman in a borrowed wedding dress, but a mature, powerful matriarch, the master of her own destiny. There is a faint, knowing smile on her lips, a look of profound and secret triumph. And if you look closely at the image at the corner of the elegant veil she wears, you can see that it is visibly, and perhaps deliberately, singed. The secrets of the past never truly die. They are buried in the earth, hidden in archives and whispered in the dark, waiting for someone willing to listen. If this unearthed tale gripped you from start to finish, hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten histories that reshape how we see the world. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. What part shocked you most? And share where you're tuning in from. Stay curious, because the real stories are always the ones they tried to hide.